Jean, what year were you born in?
1925.
And where were you born?
Paddington Women's Hospital, 14th of July.
And where did you grow up?
I grew up in the areas of Darlinghurst. Then we moved down to Woolloomooloo when I was about 11, 12.
Right. What are your earliest memories, say, in Darlinghurst?
Earliest memories are not very happy. What did you want to know about specifically, earliest memories?
What can you remember of your life in Darlinghurst? What are the earliest memories that you have of that?
I think before Darlinghurst we were at Waverley until I was about 4 or 5. They were my earliest memories. When my father left us, I never saw him anymore. I was about 4 or 5. My sister would have been 8 or 9. Never saw him anymore. Now, from there, we sort of drifted around from house to house. I don't really know why, but I would say there was quite some difficulty in paying rent.
How many kids were in the family?
My sister and myself, that's all.
And, well, what kind of a place was... Well, you would have moved to Darlinghurst really right in the midst of the worst part of the Depression, and your father
Yes.
would have left at that time.
Yes, yes. We moved into a small street called Foley Street, which was behind Oxford Street, in a very small house. I was about 9.5 or 10 years old. And I remember there was a grocery store, McElrade's grocery store, and I used to get enjoyment out of helping the truck driver unload the truck, and he'd give me a penny. And that little house was in my memories, but at that time my mother lived with a Maltese fellow, and he was very good to us. From there we moved around into Campbell Street and Darlinghurst. My mother changed addresses. She also changed her boyfriend, and now she's living with an Italian fellow, which I think some of these things when I was young influenced some of the cooking that I do now. Like the pasta dishes have got a very Italian flavour, or Maltese. We were okay there for a while, but things were very rough and tough. I can't remember how long we were there. Well, let's say 10. Then about a year or so later, we moved down to Woolloomooloo. Woolloomooloo just went from... Oh, and I was moved from school to school, Crown Street School, Darlinghurst School. I wasn't really that good at school, so it didn't really matter what school I went to. Anyway, we moved into Woolloomooloo, and then I was taken into Plunkett Street School, which was a little co-ed school then, different school to what it is now. School of about 4 or 5 rooms. Now, we used to play over in the Domain in our lunchtime and recess times. Considering there was no traffic, you could just run across the road then, and we'd play in the Domain.
What kind of a place was Darlinghurst for kids in, say, around 1930?
Well, 1930 I was only 5.
Yeah.
Now, I couldn't really remember, but going into age 10, a pretty rough and tough neighbourhood. I mean, most kids were street kids anyway. I don't remember that so much. I remember more when I moved down into Woolloomooloo, when I was about 11, 12.
And what was that like for kids?
That was rougher and tougher than anywhere. Most kids played out in the street. You never had any money. I went to Plunkett Street School. I had a billycart. I collected wood off the wharves, which I sold. Also potatoes and onions that were that you could manage to get off the wharf, because the storeman would let you in and he'd help you fill up your little billycart full of onions and potatoes. And the street life in, I mean, you could run around the streets. It was rough and tough, but pretty much there was nothing, nobody touched you really that much, as much as they do now. I'd say I'd be more wary of walking around the streets now, and yet there were a lot of crime and gangsters, but the gangsters mostly preyed on people that came from the country. They never interfered. Oh, they interfered with each other, but with the average struggling little family, there was nothing to take anyway, so they never really interfered with the little family.
And how come they picked on people from the country? Were they perceived as being wealthier? Or?
Yes, well, wool was the top export. Grazies were very wealthy then, and if they came down to Sydney for a show, they were the people to prey on. They were the only ones that had any money. Anybody from out of town was preyed upon.
Are these the Razor gangs we're talking about? I've heard them.
Razor gangs, well, it would have been in the Razor gang period of time, perhaps a bit later than that. But razors, as in cutthroat razors, I've also seen my stepfather put a razor blade into a small stick, and that would have been used to cut somebody up.
He did. He was.
Well, I don't know if he actually did anything, but he was a part-time gangster, and also a wharf labourer.
Well, you know when you say someone's a part-time gangster, what do they do being a gangster? I mean, what do you do?
Well, he had a job as a wharf labourer. A wharf labourer gave you a regular job. Gangsters, exactly. What do they do? Well, really, I don't know. It was as a matter of any sort of crime, like stealing off the wharves, selling anything that you could sell because it brought in money.
But everybody did that, didn't they? I mean, I understood, yeah,
Yes.
people would pilfer
Yes.
without being
Yes.
a gangster. I was
Yes.
wondering what special characteristics.
Well, my stepfather, I'm not quite sure what he did, but before he was living with we go on now when we're living in Woolloomooloo, before he was living with my mother, he had been keeping company with what should we call her, a gangster's moll, Nelly Cameron. Nelly Cameron had shot him in the back. He had snow white hair. He'd gone white within a week. He survived, but apparently 2 or 3 people were shot over love affairs with Nelly Cameron. Apparently he was found in bed with her and somebody shot him. No, she shot him. Maybe he was found in bed. I'm not quite sure, and my mother's never quite told me the story. My mother lived with him for quite some time. But
what was his name?
Dicky Barker, Dicky Mealing. Well, they had two. I don't know why he had 2 or 3 names. Dicky Mealing. Long since dead. About 1956, committed suicide. Growing up in Woolloomooloo, a series of parties, gangsters and crooks coming to the house, a lot of drinking. They'd send me in a taxi, and I was very young. They'd send me in a taxi to go and get sly grog, or to go and put a bet on a greyhound dog or a horse. I'd never seen a book. In my young years, I'd never seen a book. The only book I'd ever seen was a dog racing form.
You know, when you talk about the parties and all the people who'd come to your house, tell us about who some of those people were.
There were 2 brothers, Robinsons. I think one was later on, many years later, was shot. They used to come. Now, there was a couple of gangsters, I'm not quite sure of their names, but I had actually seen one gangster pistol whip another crook who was sitting in a chair at our place at a party.
How did you feel being amongst all that? I mean,
how did I feel? I didn't know. I was 12 and a half, 13 years old. I didn't know the difference.
Were you shocked at seeing that?
Yes, of course, I can see it now in my memory. I can see it happening. But when you didn't know the difference and you lived in a house where people were drunk and partying and arguing all the time, like every Thursday, it would be my job, being Thursday, being payday, So everybody got drunk, everybody got bashed up, and it would be my job to call the police regularly. I didn't know the difference until I was 13 or 14 or 15, and I went to somebody else's house, my friends, that I didn't realise why wasn't everyone drunk? You mean they're not all drunk? Why aren't they drunk? That was part of life, including a couple of girlfriends that I had, that I grew up with. Their mother was a prostitute, and she had syphilis sores all over her legs, and there was no cure then for syphilis. And those girls grew up in that kind of environment, as I did, and it never leaves your memory. It's impressed upon your memory. So you feel, yes, shocked, like protecting your mother from being bashed up, hiding under the bed because your mother's boyfriend is chasing you with an axe, and hiding under the bed for hours and terrified not to come out. It was a matter of survival. My mother did not protect me that much because it was a matter of, well, he brings the groceries. Although my mother was working, she was a barmaid at the Frisco Hotel. She was a barmaid in the Rock and Roll Hotel. The Tilbury, I can't remember the name of the Rock and Roll Hotel before they called it now, which is now a very fashionable hotel and a bistro.
What's that called? What's it called now?
What's it called now? I can't remember, but it's a hotel right on the edge of the waterfront in Woolloomooloo.
Oh, yeah.
So we moved from Blaine Street. When I lived in Blaine Street, I had been playing around in Macalone Street, and there was a fellow there, Guido Galletti. He had been shot and he was dead in the street. Now, I've read in a history book or in a crime book that he had died in a house in somebody's arms. Well, I had seen him dead in the street. He was laying out in the street, and we just went up and had a look at him. Didn't matter.
But you and when you say we, is that you and the other kids?
Billy Connolly. Didn't you interview somebody called Connolly? It was round the corner from Connolly's house, and we all ran up and had a look, all the kids. Oh. So I would have been 12 and a half then, because it was 12 and a half when I had a little billy cart.
Mm. You know when you said that on Thursday night you called the police, was that to get everybody out of the house?
Because the police come down so everybody wouldn't get bashed up, to come and break up the fights.
But given that these people were gangsters and...
Some of them were. Other men could have been off the ships. They'd come off the ships and there'd be a party.
And did your mother want you to call the police I was
sent around with a penny to call the police nearly every Thursday.
Your mother sent you?
Yeah.
So wonder that they didn't get angry with you for bringing the police.
But they're all drunk. They didn't know where I'd gone.
Ah. So
Mum would give me a penny, go round and call the police because I'm getting bashed or somebody else is getting bashed. Yeah. I might add, which has got something to do with all of this, that I am now at this present time been going to a psychiatrist for 6 months over these
experiences. Yeah. Did just want to cut that.
Okay.
Let's go back a little bit. Sort of back to the beginning, because we've jumped around and gone up until when you were much older. Well, what sort of a kid were you? How would you describe yourself as a child?
Well, you had to be aggressive, so I was a rough little street kid. If anybody came near me, I'd punch up. I'd just punch them out. So nobody, but you know, kids were. I was sort of leader of the gang, and we had another leader that helped us all build our billy carts. His name was Charlie Barley. Charlie Barley helped me put the brakes on the billy carts. Now, the billy carts weren't just to jump around in. That's what I was working with, and that was collecting potatoes and onions and wood, and I would sell to the local restaurant and the little houses all around in the street, in Nicholson Street and Bland Street and all around. Also, at that time, beer came in quart bottles. So it was my job to take the quart bottles up to the hotel because you got threepence back on the quart bottles. I mean, food was very, very cheap well, it had to be. Nobody had any money. You know, the wages were about £1 a week. This is about 1939. See, Woolloomooloo is more impressed on my memory because it was a really bad period. All right, going to the movies was a pleasure. So one Saturday afternoon I was at the movies and my mother had began living with Dicky Mealing. When I came home, he had bashed her up. Her jaw was broken and her face smashed in. She was wired up for 6 months. I went hysterical. She never told me who did it. And I went looking for the man that she'd been living with previously. So I found him and I had a knife in my hand and I was going to kill him. So my mother came and stopped me. He was trying to choke me. My mother's got a slice down her arm from the knife. She never ever told me it was Dicky Mealing that did it. So he had bashed her up, apparently, so that she would stay and live with him. So while I was at the pictures, I don't know what happened. But it must have been because they lived together then for quite some time and then she married him.
And how were you treated by Dicky? And your sister?
Dicky was okay. My sister, when I was 13, 14, my sister would have been 18. She'd already gotten married. She got married rather young then. She'd met a sailor and got married and had a son. Dennis. Dicky was okay to us, but it was all the other environment that he was involved with. So if I was in bed of a night, say 13 and a half, I was working already. Now if I was in bed and trying to sleep and I would yell out, I can't, the noise is terrible, Mum, I can't sleep, I would get a belting. And I mean, you got a belting then with the strap that they sharpened their razor on, which was about that wide. Mum was very much into belting.
Mm. Sorry.
My sister she'd married. Now, she was not in this house when I was in this house. Now, we'd moved around to Burke Street. And I had already started work in a small restaurant, little cafe. Well, we didn't call them restaurants then. They were little cafes. And the little cafe used to sell a 3-course meal for $1 to the wharf labourers. Now, I worked there every day. That was a 48-hour week for 12 and 6 a week. I did the preparing of vegetables, the cooking, the scrubbing, the cleaning, the working in the shop, serving the men. So I got back at her because I used to eat all the sweets. It was also a little shop. It's now called the Woolloomooloo Gallery. Now I'm switching from house to house. But at 13 and a half, I started work in a standard steam laundry. I was bringing home, I must have been bringing the money, whatever money I earned, I can't remember, it wasn't very much, 13 shillings, 14 shillings a week, home to my mother. I was sent every Friday. I had to walk from Woolloomooloo across the Domain into town every Friday with 2 shillings and got a tooth out. So at 14 and a half, I had no teeth.
Well, why did they do that?
I've got no idea.
Well, you went to a dentist.
Yes. It was cheaper to get your teeth pulled out than it was to get them filled. Never heard of fillings. I mean, my mother didn't know anything and she didn't enlighten herself in any way regarding what were my periods, Mum. I was never told about my periods.
What did you think was happening when you started to menstruate?
Well, I thought something had broken. I'm running down the street with blood running down my legs. Mum, what's happened to me? I've broken something. No sex. There was no sex education. If you opened your mouth about anything, you got a slap across the face.
Mm.
So periods. So the teeth, goodness knows. We were told that if you had a bath or went swimming when you had your periods, that you'd go mad. Now, there was no such thing as a book to explain to you about anything. So not only did I not know, but my mother didn't know anything and didn't bother to teach us or learn. Mm. We were taught also the conditions in Woolloomooloo in the little houses were pretty bad in sanitary conditions. In Bland Street, there was a tin bath out in the back shed and a copper, and you had to heat the water in the copper and put the water into the tin bath. Now this was quite a lot of work. So we had a bath once a week and a wash in a dish every other night. Now when you talk about jumping back, I've got to jump back to another period that you would be interested in when I was about 10. Can I jump back to that?
Yeah.
Okay. I jumped back into where we lived in Burton Street, and the back of the house ran out into the back lanes of Palmer Street. I used to play in the houses where all the prostitutes work. I was 10 years old. I remember I was 10 because at that particular time I had lice in my hair and I caught scarlet fever. Scarlet fever, then you had to be quarantined for 6 weeks in the hospital. It was fortunate in a way because then when they found the lice in my hair, they shaved your head off when you had scarlet fever, so all the lice went down with the hair. Now, I used to play in the back lanes of where the houses where all the prostitutes used to work. And they were okay to us. They'd maybe give us a penny or something to go and spend. That's what I was explaining to you, what gingering was. If a man went in, now the houses were empty. See, there were empty houses all over the place then, and you could move from one house to another. There were empty houses which now have got the Blue Angel restaurants on the same houses. You could go into the back of the house. A man would go into the back of the house and a lady would take him upstairs. He would hang his coat on the banister downstairs. While he was upstairs having sex with the lady or whatever they were doing, another lady, well, a lady for want of a better term, another lady would come in and steal anything that he had in his pockets. That was a term called gingering. One of the women, or once or twice on different occasions, if the police had been after them, they'd come into the back of our house and ask my mother, could we run through to the front door? Then they'd be in a different street. So my mother would often say, yes, come through, and they'd run through the house and escape through the other way. Right, that goes back to the Palmer Street area where we lived. But I was younger then, yes, 10. All right, now we go back to Woolloomooloo. Okay. What else? Okay, gangsters, I don't know.
Can I ask a question? You know how you said your father left when you were 4 or 5?
Yes.
What did he do for a job? Do you know what he was employed in?
Yes, he was a night watchman at a museum in Exhibition Park, the Exhibition Museum, which no longer exists. Because I remember, and I only remember that because my mother was trailing him and she took me with him to watch him and see what he was doing.
Well, so,
he was a mining engineer, or worked in the very early stages. He was in Newcastle as a miner in the coal mines.
Right.
And that's where Nana Jurd and all those people were all Newcastle, Maitland, all that area, and then they came down the river to those other areas. But he worked in the mines. He's on my birth certificate as a miner.
As a miner.
Coal mining.
Right. And do you think, did he leave because of the stresses of the depression or the financial stresses, or was it because he wasn't getting on very well with your mother?
I don't know.
Oh, you don't
I was
know.
4 to 5. My mother's never told me anything about him.
Oh.
Nothing at all. She's only ever said he was, the day I was born, he was out with some prostitute, and he's a bastard, and we've never seen him since. And that's all she's ever told me about him.
Right.
I've got a photograph taken with him when I was about 4, with an auntie and an uncle in Katoomba, which was the place to go if you had any sort of holiday. My auntie would have taken us there for a holiday, not my mother or my father. My auntie would have taken us.
Right. Do you think that your mother ended up moving from, you said she lived in where was it?
Waverley, Bronte, when my father left.
Yes. And do you think that her moving, and that would have been a better or more affluent area presumably than Darlinghurst, was it at that time?
Darling, I can't remember then. I was 4 or 5. I wouldn't remember that. I don't know about that.
So
I would say that once, it might have been, we could have afforded more, I expect, because then my father was there. But once he left, I suppose we went downhill. See, there was no support for mothers or children then. There was no support.
Yes, that's what I was sort of getting at. Like, so her subsequent lifestyle was a matter of
Survival.
Survival and supporting the children.
Yes.
She worked as a barmaid.
Yes, and cleaner, office cleaner.
Right. Well, with the men that she was living with, I mean, didn't they also support the family? I mean...
well, I suppose they must have, but perhaps it would seem that whatever was brought into the house was spent, well, on food and groceries and drinking, alcohol. I mean, the food, I can't remember great supplies of food when I was 12, 13. I wouldn't say we sat down to a three-course dinner. There was no such thing known as a three-course dinner.
Did your mother cook an evening meal?
There might have been on the weekend a rabbit or a chicken, vegetables, I remember.
What would be a typical evening meal in your house?
Oh dear, well that is hard to remember. Yes, we're back to the bread and dripping.
Really? Okay.
Bread and dripping, bread and milk with sugar on.
How?
Maybe some vegetables, as I say, maybe once a week there'd be one rabbit with vegetables, one chicken, maybe on the weekend, which you had to kill and cut the head off and pluck it and do all that stuff, so that was quite an ordeal. I often remember the chicken with its head cut off and bleeding and hanging upside down and stuff like that.
Where would they get these live chooks from?
Well, there'd be a horse and cart man that would come around with the rabbits, the same as the man with the horse and cart that would sell clothes props, milk. So there would be a horse and cart come around with milk, skim milk mainly. We'd get, because it was cheaper.
Right.
You got more. I think you'd get a quart for a penny or 2 pennies. Milk, at that stage too, milk was provided at schools. A small bottle of milk was provided free at schools. So, but very much else. We were on the dole, and the dole as compared to now, the dole was just a coupon, and that would give you your basic needs of bread and butter, jam, tea, sugar. Very little else. Perhaps we might have had a stew or some meat. I can't really remember. It was... I can't really remember what the evening meal would be, but Mum would have had some vegetables, yes.
Were you expected to contribute to the household in any way, either with the job, like, you know, you said selling the potatoes and onions?
Yes.
What else would you be expected to do by way of contribution?
Well, I was 12 and a half then, so I had to, although I enjoyed coming home from school and going down the wharves with my little billy cart, it was like a freedom. Taking the quart bottles up to the hotel to get the money back. Then when I started work, that money went to my mother, which was 12 and 6 a week. That was in the little cafe. And then I had to go on a waiting list to get into the laundry. So when I was 13 and a half to 14, I would say 14, then I was employed in the laundry. Now, we worked 6 days a week. I think 5 days and maybe till 1 o'clock Saturday. So it was a 48-hour week. There was no, or maybe then 44 hours a week then.
What did you do at that laundry there at the age of 13?
No, 14.
Oh,
14 at the laundry. Okay, I'd be pressing shirts. I worked on a big machine and was pressing shirts, sheets and tablecloths into the other big room where all the sheets and tablecloths, and I was there for quite a few years because I worked there during World War II. So I was there for quite a few years. And I met some beautiful girlfriends there. And this is where I found out that I went to girlfriends' houses and they weren't all drunk. I remain to this day a friend of my beautiful girlfriend that I work with. When she got married to a sailor after the war, I was the bridesmaid. She lives in Adelaide and we're still friends.
Was your family, given that your family sounds like it was pretty wild, Did you suffer any kind of discrimination? Like, were other kids not allowed to play with you? Yeah,
No, because everybody was a sort of everybody struggles for survival. The only thing I did find, discrimination, I didn't really notice, and I didn't know. Everybody's family was having drinks. I don't know that they're all getting drunk or having, now I'm contradicting myself there, I'm just saying when I went to work, I met families, but they used to come to our house. But I found as I grew older that if anybody came to the house, like a boyfriend, as I got to be 16, 17, 18, I'd never see them anymore. They never came back because they couldn't believe that they came into this house and that's, there was all this trouble and I'd have to excuse myself while I either went and got the police or we couldn't stay at home because there was an argument. And that went on for years later until I was 21 or 22 and a boyfriend of mine suggested, why don't you leave home? That was the best move I ever made.
So I wondered, was there any such thing as the welfare, the equivalent of facts around then? I mean, or the state didn't care, or,
Well, welfare, to come and see, I do believe there was welfare, that if you weren't looked after, they'd come and check you out.
Well, it didn't.
No. Yeah, but who would report you to the welfare? I didn't know what to do. Kids weren't informed on what to do. You didn't know anything about. It would only be somebody like maybe a neighbour who was concerned about you that might have rang up the welfare.
And you never had any visits from people inquiring as to what was happening in the residence?
No. And if the police came a few times about the drinking and the bashings and everything, yes, wouldn't you think they'd report it to the welfare? But see, it was not an ongoing... police didn't report those things. I mean, it was enough for them to come down and stop fight and then they'd go away. They'd done their job and then they'd go away. They weren't involved in anything like they are now, and certainly not in what's happening to the family. They didn't give a damn what was happening to the family. Education was... I mean, there was no sex education at schools. There was no sex education at home.
Was it safe environment sexually for you at home? I mean, with all these men there...
I had been approached once or twice, and I remember my mother saying, no, leave her alone, she's too young. I was 13. Now, we used to go... There was a gangster called Frank Green, supposed to be a notorious gangster, and we used to go swimming when I was about 14, 15, with my girlfriend from the laundry, Frances, that I've just mentioned. She lives in Adelaide. Said that. We used to go swimming with Frank Green's daughter, who had paralysis. And I've got to give him credit in that although he was a big-time gangster, if he saw us in the streets of a night coming home from the picture show, or it was dark or it was late, he'd always ask us, are you girls okay? Do you want me to make sure you go home now and make sure you're home all right? They would look after their own kind. They really only... Although they were gangsters and they'd fight amongst themselves, but the kids and that, no, they didn't do anything to the kids. The kids was very much, I suppose they all understood that we were just struggling kids trying to grow up in a neighbourhood that was pretty rough on us. When I was about 13, I remember some of the wives coming down and screaming out at me. I was on the balcony with a lot of bad language about getting my husband's, get my husband out of this house. I had no idea. But I mean, there was a party on downstairs and the wives had come to see where their husbands were. But that more had to do with my mother and my stepfather, although they weren't married yet. She lived with him for about 7 years before she got married.
And did, so the wives didn't come with their husbands to the parties at your place?
No. It was mostly the men. Well, it was a society too where men were mostly getting away from their wives. I mean, taking your wife with them. Well, I can't remember too many ladies being there unless there were ladies from somewhere else. But no, there weren't any wives. It was just a party amongst the men because there'd be a lot of drinking and then there'd be the races. They would send me in a taxi to some place to get a sly grog, which was the after hours.
Where would you get the sly grog from?
Yes. I was sent in a taxi. Now, I'm not sure where I went. I know his name, and now I don't know if he's dead or alive.
What year are we talking about?
I was 14.
It's in the 30s.
So I don't know, well, it'd be 1940, 39, the war had started. My sister had already gotten married to a sailor and she'd had a young son.
Oh, the individual doesn't matter. You'd go to...
We say his name was, I do know his name. We say his name was, we went to Toss's house. There's another surname, I know it. But I could get shot. If he's still alive, goodness knows. Yeah. We went to Toss's house and whatever was beer, whatever was sold, like I don't know, but I'd be sent in a taxi to get the beer and come back home. I was 12, 13, 14. I'd be sent to put sixpence each way on a dog or a horse. And there was always a bookie in the back lane. They were always in the back lanes.
When you mean in the back lane, I mean, wouldn't they need to be in a house where they can write notes? Well,
they were in the back of a house that ran out into the back lane. See, most of these little houses, if you go down Woolloomooloo and look around, you'll see a lot of the little houses went into back streets and back lanes. There was the room, although they're only little houses, but there were backyards, and usually they operated out of somebody's backyard. And yes, there would be notes. And so they'd shoot through to the other side of the house if the police came.
What was your view of the police at that time? I mean, what did people think of the police? Were they viewed as... Well,
I could only view them as they'd come to help us because I'd go and ring them up. But the view of the police at that time, at 12 and 13, I never had much of a view. My view of the police was only that you went and called them and they'd come down to make sure somebody wasn't getting bashed up. I can't remember. I think they came in a paddy wagon. Maybe they took somebody away. I can't remember that. Because probably after I called the police, I'd be out in the streets playing.
But if you were roaming around the streets with your billy cart and what have you, and you'd bump into, policemen, surely they'd get to know you as the kid who lived in that house where they were always being called.
Well, if they came down to the house enough, yes, they should have got to know me.
And you never had any encounters with them in the street?
No. This would have been the war broke out 1939, so what was I, 40, I would have been 15, 1940, I was 15. Now, my sister had married a sailor and had a son who is now 52, 53 years old and has been an alcoholic since he was 18, 19. This would have been brought upon him from the environment that he grew up. You either grow up out of this and you either get out of it or you don't get out of it. My sister was an alcoholic. She died about 10, 12 years ago of alcoholism and lung cancer. I mean, the style of life, I don't think... If you came from a decent, normal home, which ours was not, I don't think people could really believe how you grew up.
What I wanted to ask is that your mother doesn't sound like a very nice sort of person.
And she's still alive. She's 95.
Yes, Kate's mentioned her to me. What I wanted to know is that, look, she managed to attract all these men and had relationships with a number of them and have these parties there.
Yes.
I mean, was she attractive? I mean, was she a good-looking woman?
Yes. When she used to go with a wrestler, she also was wrestling.
What do you mean?
Well, she would go to the gymnasium and work out with him as wrestling. Now, that wrestler was Maltese. He was very good to us. I was 10 years old then. And she would go to the gymnasium. Consequently, we'd all go to the stadium at Rushcutters Bay and we saw every wrestling match. But my mother was a very healthy, fit and good-looking woman.
Even with all the drinking?
Now, later on, no, I was 10. She started to drink round about after the Maltese fellow when I was 11, 12. Then it went downhill. But prior to that, let's see if I got a photograph of her when she was young. It's more in her album. I've got some photographs if you want to have a look.
Yeah.
I've got a photograph of her and Dicky Mealing when they got married. And Dicky Mealing is the, well, he was a wharf labourer and a part-time crook and gangster. When I say gangster, it was not a top gangster. It was what we used to call little half pie, a bit of this or a bit of that, to get some money, to do anything with.
And what happened with the Maltese? What was the Maltese man's name?
Joe Ketos.
Right.
He was a wrestling champion of the South Pacific. So consequently, I'd seen a lot of wrestling matches when I was quite young, 10 years old, at the stadium. He wrestled with the top wrestlers of the time, Big Chief, Little Wolf. Some of the others' names I can't remember. I'd have to research that to look who was wrestling. So we used to go to a lot of the wrestling matches.
Your mother must have been quite a difficult kind of, I mean, well, ahead of a time or whatever, because it would have been really unacceptable at that time for women to be around gymnasiums, because they were virtually male-only places, weren't they, that I understand?
Yes, she used to wrestle with him. Yes, that's right. She used to wrestle with him in the gymnasium. Well, it could have been his gymnasium, now that I come to think of it. I think he had a gymnasium.
Right.
I haven't got a photograph. Those photographs are in her old photograph album. I haven't got a photograph of him, or my mother maybe at that stage. But
she certainly seems very single-minded and independent.
Well, you had to be. Well, yes, independent. I suppose. A freedom that she was doing her own thing, and that you could live with these other men. A period of time. She'd also go out with any of the men that came off the ships. I think she used to go with a very good-looking Norwegian fellow who wanted to marry her and take us home to Norway, which might have been a good life. Cold. But he was first mate or second mate on one of the ships. See, we would walk across the road to the wharves. So when the ships came in, if any men came off the ships with money, well, it was come to our house for drinks, bring the groceries. I remember my mother saying that, bring the groceries, because it was to feed us.
Did that have to stop when she was with, when she got together with Dick Mealing?
Yes.
Mealing,
yes.
is
Mealing.
it? Mealing.
Mealing. Yes. Yes, we went, we moved from Bland Street to Burke Street, and then it stopped. If she was living with somebody, there wouldn't be other men around.
Was she able to operate like that without a pimp or anything like that? I mean,
oh well, she wasn't really a prostitute,
right.
But it was a matter of living with somebody that was looking after us, or
I meant picking up the men from the boats and that kind of thing. Like it was sort of, were women free to be able to just to pick up people like that, or were the gangsters controlling that?
Now you say that, I'm wondering.
Do you know what I'm saying? Was it a controlled industry? Because that's what she was doing.
No. When you lived near the wharves, the men would just walk up off the ships, and if you were... I mean, houses were then on the street. There was no balcony. So if you had your door open... Well, funny thing you should say that. I don't know why. I don't know if she ever stood at the door and actually picked up the men. I don't know.
There's your comment, and bring the groceries, and I was thinking her association with the gangsters. How
did she? I don't even know how she ever met these fellows. I suppose it would be in the local pub. Goodness knows. The gangsters. Well, when she met Dicky Mealing, see if they're all friends with each other. That would be where the parties and the drinking were held at our house.
I was wondering if the gangsters that were, those gangs, and particularly the higher up gangsters.
No, we didn't. No, there weren't that many higher up gangsters that came to our house. They were just sort of little, small time gangsters.
Can I ask, were they good-hearted to you? Do you know how you can have an image of a gangster? The word gangster can be a very mean kind of word.
I can't remember them being good-hearted. There was, no, I can't remember them being good-hearted in any way. It was just a matter of having a house to come and have a party in.
Right.
When I was 13 to 14, if I yelled out, Mum, I can't sleep, I would be belted. So Mum's priority was whoever was in the house drinking, and by drinking they would provide something else, either food, maybe money. I don't know. I really don't know that.
Were there other drugs around at that time? Was there anything like opium or anything like that around
there weren't any drugs as such in our house, but now we go back to Darlinghurst. When I was 9, I remember running into the opium dens near Darlinghurst school.
Running into them?
Yes. All the Chinese were laying on bunks in the opium den behind Darlinghurst school.
Right.
I was 9.
And
There was a hotel on the corner behind Campbell Street, and I remember in one of the hotels some people, now they said, I don't know about drugs, some people came out and they put this fellow in the lane and kicked him to death, and his brains fell out.
okay, we'll get that back on.
Now that was in Campbell Street. That was when my mother used to live with this Italian fellow,
Okay.
Mario.
Okay. Okay. You said you used to go to the other opium dens in...
There was an opium den in Campbell Street somewhere. Now I'm talking about Campbell Street, Darlinghurst, but Campbell Street went down to Chinatown. When I was about 9, I used to run into this opium den. I remember seeing the Chinese laying on bunks, just all smoking opium. And they'd just tell you to go out, so you'd go out.
And were kids just free to sort of wander in there? You had that much freedom as a child to go
I don't
in?
know, the door must have been opened and I must have just gone in. I remember I'd been in there a few times. See, there were a lot of Chinese about too at that time.
Was there mixing between Chinese and Anglo-Australians? Do you have Chinese friends?
I remember at school that we had friends of all kinds. There were Aboriginals and black people, and we were never taught discrimination. Our next door neighbours in Bland Street were Aboriginal, and we grew up together. We were never taught any prejudice, which I suppose was a good thing about my mother. She never taught us that somebody was either religious or black, because there was no such thing as religion. I was sent to Sunday school, but it didn't matter. We used to go to Sunday school for a minute and then play hooky and go swimming or run around the domain.
So when you went into the Chinese, into the opium dens, was that...
that was in Darlinghurst.
Yeah, did you know people there and were...
No, I just used to run in, the doors were open, I'd run in, they'd all be freaked out on benches, smoking opium. Just run out. I wasn't going to stay there, so I suppose I ran out.
Did you know what it was or what that
No.
place was?
No.
You didn't think it was an odd
No.
kind of place?
Oh, well, I knew I shouldn't have been there, I knew it wasn't right. And they're all laying down on these dreadful little bunks. I mean, the place looked dark and dingy. I remember that. Now, that was situated somewhere near the Crown Street Women's Hospital, in between the Crown Street Women's Hospital and Darlinghurst School somewhere, when we lived in Campbell Street, which is at the back of Kinsella's. Kinsella's used to be a funeral parlour then.
Do you think that bloke was attacked because he hadn't paid somebody what he owed them or something? The one that was kicked to death.
I've got no idea. They just came out of the hotel and put him in the lane and kicked him to death.
This was a pub up there.
They came out, yes, a little pub. Little pub is, I think it's still on the corner. And,
That was gangster Australian people who...
well, yes. Now, when you say Australian people...
I mean Anglo-Australians, sorry.
Yes, but, I mean, there wasn't the immigration here then, so nearly everybody I'm speaking about is Australian.
Was
See, the
Anglo-
immigration never started to come in until after World War II.
Yet you say that your schooling, you had lots of different people there, like that Yeah,
well, I suppose I'm classing them as Australian. We were all Australian.
Yes.
If there are any Aboriginals there, we never thought anything that we were different. So our schoolmates were all of us together, boys and girls.
And you've mentioned your mother's friends, the Maltese and the Italian. So there was some...
Yes, okay. So where did they come from? All right, the Italian fellow had a cane... Oh.
That's okay.
The Italian fellow had a cane farm in Ingham. And he'd come down on vacation.
Sorry.
Which reminds me of Summer of the 17th Doll. He had come down, isn't it strange? Now, he lived with us for quite some time. He was very good looking. But when I come to think of it, he was more interested in my 16-year-old sister than my mother. My 16-year-old sister was 17 years old, then she got married. No, it was before she got married, 15. She was honey-coloured hair, very fair, very good looking, beautiful looking girl. Very well developed, as I was too when I was 13, 14. Very well developed girls. The Italian would have come from Queensland. Where the Maltese fellow came from, I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Can I ask, was your mother or your family, some of the men who were living with your mother, was anyone involved, were they politically active in any way?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
Oh, there was a lot of talk at that time coming, now of course I can think about where it was coming from, because the Depression was on. And there was a lot of wharf labourers talking about communism at that time to give people a better life. Other politics I didn't know anything about.
So, at some of the parties at your mother's house, were they often there talking about politics?
No.
No.
I've never heard anything about politics at the party. It'd be racing, dog racing, horse racing, drinking.
Well, when you say that there was...
And singing was a big deal.
What were some of the songs?
Oh God, some of the songs in 1939, oh dear. I've got to go into deep thought about that. I don't know, it'd be all the old songs that I suppose that grew up with my mother. Ramona. No? All the old. Now I'd have to think and get that. I'd have to just think for a while about that. Richard Tauber was the leading singer at that time, baritone, opera singer. Gladys Moncrief. I remember we went to the Trocadero. My mother took us to see Gladys Moncrief. But the songs, I can't remember the songs. I'd have to think. I'd have to be given time to think about the songs that used to be sung.
Okay. Well, you know how you said you heard about people talking about communism and what have you. So where would you hear them talking? Where have you got this memory from?
The wharf labourers in the little cafe where I used to work.
Right.
A lot of the wharf labourers then were going into, they were all talking about communism a lot. The unions and people like that getting together. But I was only 13, 14, I didn't understand any of that.
Can you remember them talking about Lang?
Yes, but I don't know what was said. But I do remember them talking about Lang.
Was it favourable or unfavourable?
No, I can't remember, Sue. I can't remember.
Okay. We've talked, the next question is what sort of discipline was used, but we've talked about, was it pretty...
None. Discipline over the children? Well, none, unless you caused, like, Mum, I can't sleep. There's a party. It's very noisy. What discipline? I got a belting. There was no discipline. I'd be out in the street.
And did you have to be home at some time from playing out in the street? Were you expected to be in by 6 or 7?
Yes, but that didn't matter. I'd climb out the bedroom window and over the fence. I was a tomboy kid, so I was out. She didn't know where I was anyway. And then she was drinking and having a party. So I suppose, yes, I would have had to come home. And if I went to the pictures when I was 14, 15, if I went to the pictures, I would have had to come home then at a certain hour. But that was more now Dicky Mealing. I can't remember if he had any control over us, so I just can't remember. He never beat us. Dicky Mealing was, I suppose, a provider and quite good to us. But it was the environment and the people that he was mixed up with that came to the house for parties.
Well, who was he mixed up with? Who were some of these people?
Well, these are the gangsters, some of the gangsters of the time, but I can't remember their names. Sue, I can't remember the names. The fellow where I went for sly grog, Tosser.
Is that his real nickname?
Yes.
Okay.
He would have had... now some of the other gangsters, Robinson. Jackie Hodder. H-O-D. Jackie Hodder. He was some sort of gangster. I remember a couple of the names.
Well, I keep hearing about Kate Lee and Tilly Devine from lots of people, but nobody's really seems to have met them.
Well, they were the houses in Palmer Street, where the girls, where I used to play.
Did that Kate and
Kate Lee had the sly grog shop. Kate Lee and Tilly Devine both had houses where the prostitutes used to work in Palmer Street.
So they were madams. They ran the...
Yes.
And were they friends? Did they work together or were they rivals?
No, they were rivals. They were rivals.
And did they ever come to the parties at your mum's house?
No. No, they were big time. We were only little. They were big time.
Okay. Well, what did the family do for fun?
Oh, dear, yeah. Well, that was it. Parties and carry on parties. My God. Yeah. That's about it.
Were you, as you got older, were you expected to be part of these parties, or did they want you out of the way and out of sight?
Well, now, age group, when I was 10, I keep saying 10, don't I? All right, my mother lived with an Italian fellow in Campbell Street, the Italian fellow, Mario from Queensland. Some people used to come to our house and my mother would try to get rid of us. I don't know where my sister was. She was working. Now, she could have been working on the Saturday, because in those days you had to work on the Saturday. I would be sent to the pictures with some Italian fellow, a friend of the Italian fellow that my mother used to live with. I was taken to Darlinghurst West pictures. There's another period of my life too that goes before 10. We go back to Waverley, but anyway, I'll stay right now on the age of 10. So the fellow would take me to the pictures and he would put a coat over his lap and he would undo his pants and I would have to play with his penis throughout the whole show. When I told my mother about it, I was given a belting, and every time the man used to come on Saturday afternoon to take me to the pictures, I would hide under the bed. When I went to my psychiatrist 6 months ago, I practically collapsed in his arms. And they were the first words I said. Mummy, Mummy, don't send me with this man. Mummy, Mummy, don't send me with this man.
Were they sort of like an every night event, or?
No, I don't think it was an every night event. Would have been once or twice a week, and probably particularly after payday. But every night it'd probably be listening to the radio.
And what sort of programs would you listen to on the radio?
Well, of course it'd be Dad and Dave. Dad and Dave and any of the other little programs that they had. I think they had Dad and Dave when I was young. I really can't remember. It would be just around the radio. I mean, if you had a radio, then you were quite fortunate.
Did you have one?
Yes, we did have it.
A lot of kids in the neighbourhood?
Yes, I suppose. Although when I had my billycart, I always seemed to be a loner. I was a one-out kid. I can't remember anybody else that had a billycart. Well, they had billycarts, but they didn't go and collect wood. So I was familiar with every wharf in Woolloomooloo. And there weren't any other kids that came with me. The only one that came with me was a little fox terrier dog called Spot. And Spot would come with me when he heard me with the barrow. He was 2 or 3 doors up the street, and he used to love to come with me. So that brings me back to being pretty much of a loner, because I was out with my little wheelbarrow. But I loved it because I was free. I was scooting down the street, and sometimes I'd run onto some of the ships and pinch anything I could find, although there wasn't much. But I remember once going onto a ship after a Christmas party for what we used to call the posh kids. The posh kids had a Christmas party. And I found a little wooden horse, a little toy, hanging on the tree underneath that they'd missed. So I pinched that and then ran off the ship. But they were used to me running onto the wharf, so nobody used to pay much attention. You know, they knew times were tough, and they knew you were probably just going to pick up whatever you could find around on the wharves, which was a lot of wood. So things came in crates, packing cases. So they'd be broken, or they'd be accidentally broken, or purposely broken. Where all the wood came from, I've got no idea. But that's what I used to pack up and sell.
And what? Oh, you sold the wood?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I sold the wood.
Where? To what? Other houses?
Any of the shops, because everybody had little fires. Any of the shops and the houses around. Most of anybody with the houses in the area.
And what did other kids do with their billy carts? You said that...
No, we all used to scoot up and down the streets. I mean, considering there was hardly any traffic. So the streets were quite good for billy carts. But I can't remember another kid that actually worked with their billy cart with me. I was a loner and went and got the wood and the potatoes and onions and went round then and sold them. And then I gave that money to my mother. So
Did you do that voluntarily, or were you told to go and do it?
In the first place, I can't remember. But because I had the billy cart, I might have been told to go and do it. But I really can't remember.
Okay. Well, who were your friends in the neighbourhood?
Well, being a little boys' co-ed school, any of the boys and girls, by name?
Yeah.
Oh, gee, by name. McBurney's, there were brothers and sisters. Lily and Betty, whose mother they were having quite a hard time. They were my friends all around in the streets. My next door neighbours, who were part Aboriginal or full Aboriginal, whose name were Hales, Hales, Nini Hales and her children. We were all friends. And as I say, there was no such thing then as any... I didn't know what discrimination was, never heard of the word. You were friends at school and they were your friends. Then my girlfriends Frances and Emily that we used to go swimming with. But then I'd started work. I met them when I started work. So we used to go swimming.
And what sort of things would you do with your friends? You know,
well,
when you were
swimming,
child? Yeah.
walking around the botanical gardens, or when I say the botanical gardens, the domain. You could walk up through the domain. In those days too, we'd go to the domain on Sunday afternoon. That's when everybody stood on a box and told all their political views. We weren't that interested in politics. We couldn't understand it. Well, we didn't understand it.
Can you remember any of the particular characters who'd be up there on this?
Mrs. Green used to scream out. We loved her. She'd be frantic. She'd be screaming out about church and religion and everything. Now, as close as we were to the art gallery, strangely enough, we never went in the art gallery, so I never knew anything about the art gallery. We used to go check out behind the art gallery to see who'd been playing up in the grass.
Yes.
You'd find all these French letters. We didn't know what they were. But you'd find all these French letters around, you know, which is, well, the term is still used now. But we'd never seen the art gallery. So the domain on a Sunday afternoon, the botanical gardens, swimming on Saturdays and Sundays down the domain bars. Picture show Saturday afternoon.
Would you go with your friends ever?
Yes, I did go with my friends to the picture show. Now this is when, when I lived in Woolloomooloo, we'd come up to the King's Cross picture show. What would I have been? Yeah, 14, I suppose, 14. So it was sixpence in to the picture show. If you got sixpence, or if you had a penny to spend, you were lucky. If you didn't, you ran in the shop and stole a chocolate and ran out the other door. He'd have to be quick to catch me. They never caught me. So you'd see, the pictures, Tom Mix, Hopalong Cassidy, all those Western 2-bit movies that they had, you know, serials that they had, and you couldn't wait to get there next week to see what happened. Roy Rogers. And of course, idols were like Judy Garland, Deanna Durbin, and all those beautiful young child, Shirley Temple, all those young child that you went off into a fantasy about because it was so beautiful. They wore all these beautiful clothes and they could sing and dance. What else? Questions now, I'm running out.
Okay. Well, how far could you roam? How free were you to roam?
Well, Woolloomooloo to King's Cross was a ways, quite a while, I suppose, a mile.
And would you go further? Like, would you ever get on a tram or the ferry and just...
Yeah, cut that just for a minute, darling.
Okay. Did you ever get on just a tram and go sort of much further afield than where you could go as a pedestrian?
Well, we'd get on the tram and come down to Bondi swimming. We used to swim at 7 Shilling Beach at Double Bay. We'd go on the train to National Park and hike down to the Warranori River and go camping and swimming. Not overnight, we'd be back by the evening.
How old were you when you'd go down there?
15.
What about when you were younger, when you were 10, 11 and 12? Could you just sort of take off from home and go where you liked?
I used to visit a girlfriend that lived in Sydenham, and I would go in the train to Sydenham when I was 10, 11. Yes, when my mother lived with a Maltese wrestler, her friend Lucy used to live with a Maltese chap, and the daughter and I were friends. Now, they lived at Sydenham, so at 10, I would go to Sydenham on the train.
Now, was it a safe sort of area in which to roam around?
Yes, I would say it was safer then for a kid on a train than it would be now. I'm frightened now of being on a train, in the night time on my own.
What about Woolloomooloo and King's Cross?
King's Cross was pretty safe. King's Cross then was like a little village where most of the people knew everybody, and kids were okay in King's Cross. You never got into much trouble in King's Cross unless you wanted to make trouble. And making trouble was only running past the fruit shop and pinching the oranges and the apples if they were on a stand outside.
Speaking about shops, where did most people shop?
David's had a grocery store in... was near Cathedral Street. Now it was Burke Street. I think it was in Burke Street. David's had a small grocery shop. I remember that's where we used to go with our dole coupons. And we used to wait outside David's. David's now is a very big chain store of grocery providers, but whether it's still David's or not, I don't know. One of the Davids was trying to take my sister out. I wish she'd married him. We would have ended up nearly David's millionaire supermarket stores. But David's was the only little shop. Oh, and maybe some corner shop, if there was a corner shop.
Well, you mentioned the Italian fruit stalls. The fruit stores. Were they run by Italians?
Well, the Italian fellow that my mother lived with, we had a little fruit shop for a very short time in Stanley Street. Italians seem to be, yes, fruit shops. So I suppose we had the fruit shop. We didn't live there, but we must have lived in Campbell Street, and he had this little fruit shop.
And what about meat and things like that? Were there local butchers and haberdasheries and those sorts of things?
Haberdasheries. Well, I can't remember haberdasheries because I was never encouraged to sew. Oh, I did do some sewing. No, that was much later on. I was never encouraged to sew, so I didn't know anything about haberdashery shops.
But you know, sort of the normal, so-called normal, the sort of shops that would have been newsagents, general merchandise, chemists.
I suppose all those.
You don't remember any, if there were
I
any
remember.
around?
I remember in now this when we lived in Woolloomooloo. I remember shops like tailor shops, a hardware shop.
Well, where were they located?
Hardware shop. Now there was a hardware shop called Carroll's, and Carroll's have still got a hardware shop on the corner, I think, of Riley Street and William Street, and they've tried to buy him out. Well, now it would be the son or maybe the grandson, and they won't sell, and that little hardware shop is still standing on the corner, because I was down there yesterday or the day before.
And it sounds to me from what you're saying that the shops were sort of scattered about the place rather than being like a main street of shops.
Well, there was no such thing as a shopping mall then. No. I mean, if you came into King's Cross was a whole row of shops, because later on, when I was 14, 15, I would have been in the laundry, a lot longer after that, because I worked in a few shops in King's Cross. I worked in Woolworths, a cake shop, a fruit shop, and different shops, but that was, I think, maybe after the war. That was later on. But King's Cross was a whole row of shops.
Yeah, and like at Newtown, you had King Street, Newtown, and there was Botany Road.
William Street would have been the shopping centre from Woolloomooloo.
Right.
William Street.
What about down near the wharf now, where there's a whole lot of stuff facing the wharf? Is it Cowper Road, facing like the Finger Wharf?
Yes.
There's a lot of sort of gallery type shops there. Were they?
Well, the gallery, the little Woolloomooloo Gallery, is the place where I got my first job. That's where I worked in the little cafe.
Yeah, no, and I was wondering if there were any other...
No.
No?
No. There was a garage across the road because I got sixpence for cleaning the toilets and the sink when I was about 12 or 14. A garage, I remember, a little grocery shop on a corner, and the pubs. Pubs seemed to be the main... See, there was a pub on every corner. And then the odd little grocery shop. Up all of the streets had little grocery shops. Haberdashery, I can't remember.
And did most people do their shopping at those little local corner kind of shops?
Yes, because in those days when you didn't have money, you went to the local shop because you could get it on tick until you got paid, or until dole day, or until whatever, and then you went up and paid. And if you went up and paid, and then they would give you some boiled lollies in a little piece of paper for the kid who went up and paid the bill.
And do people do their shopping mostly on a daily basis?
Yes, because you never had any money to buy anything like in advance. You would just go and get what you needed for that day, your bread and your milk and your jam.
In terms of your household furnishings and appliances, what would you have had? Like, were there, I'm presuming...
There would be an iron, I suppose, but not an electric iron. It would have been... might have been an electric iron, a radio, an ice box that you put ice in. There was no such... We never had a refrigerator. Well, not when I was young. There was an ice box, and the iceman came every day or every second day, and you got a block of ice. Now, ice boxes went way into up to World War II.
What other deliveries were there? What were the sort of things that would get delivered?
The man would come in a horse and cart with rabbits. There would be a man with a horse and cart with vegetables. A man with a horse and cart selling clothes props. Am I on?
Yeah.
The milkman would come, and those were the days when you could, nobody had any money, so, you just went out to the little horse and cart and got your milk by a pint or a quart from the back of the little cart. It was all in bulk. Milk was distributed in bottles at school, but you never usually got bottles at home. You got it in a billy can.
With all these horses and carts around, there must have been a lot of horse manure around. Was the place dirtier than it is today?
No, not really. No.
Was it more
Perhaps
polluted
if somebody...
with all the wood fires than it is now?
Maybe with the wood fires it possibly was, but we weren't aware of that pollution, so we didn't know we were polluting the air.
So when your memories, and when you think back, do you think of it as being a dirty, polluted sort of place?
No. No, not really. I can't remember the streets being that dirty.
What were the common illnesses at the time? Did people, if you fell over in the street, were there any cases of tetanus? Because tetanus breeds in, horse.
When I was 10, I had scarlet fever. That was a common illness at the time. Diphtheria was a common illness. Impetigo, I remember having impetigo, although I was much younger. And I remember that very well because my mother belted me around the legs and the sores came off, the impetigo, and the blood ran down my legs. I remember that. But I was much younger then. But impetigo, that was, of course, from dirt and not being washed and cleaned properly. See, we never had the hygiene education. I remember joining the Cubs, and one of the questions was, how often do you bathe? I said once a week. I couldn't believe people said once a day. We weren't told about bathing once a day. You had a wash in a tin dish. That's when I was 8, 9, 10.
Where was the Cubs group meeting at?
Oh, now, where was
that local?
I think it was local in Woolloomooloo, perhaps somewhere at the Police Boys Club in Riley Street, Woolloomooloo. But I didn't stay there very long because it was too much. It was discipline. You had to learn all the lessons. And I didn't like that, so I didn't hang out there for very long.
Were there other things like playgrounds or play centres for kids at that time?
No. We went from Plunkett Street over into the Domain to play, so there was no play centres.
Okay. Were there any places as a kid that you were not allowed to go? Where your mother told you you're not to go there?
No, not really. Okay. No.
People that you had to avoid?
No.
What games did you play as a kid? You've mentioned the swimming.
Yes, swimming, hopscotch, skipping. If somebody up the street had a bike, you would try and ride the push bike, but of course you were very special if you had a little push bike. The games we played were mostly out in the street. No, that was about all.
Okay. Did you have any toys as a kid?
I must have had. I can't remember. Do you know, I can't remember any such thing as a doll, but I must have had. Or a teddy bear. I can't remember. I did a lot of fantasy things at home, like trying to teach kids at school on the steps, on the stairs in the house or something like that, so I was playing really on my own.
But could you bring your friends home? Your school friends and kids from the street, were they free to come into the house?
I can't remember too many children coming into our house. No. The kids from next door, but it wasn't so much of coming into the house, and I expect it was because we all wanted to escape from the houses that we were in, so we were all out in the streets playing. And you just run around and play anything in the streets.
And were you free to go to other kids' homes? Was it sort of
Yes.
coming in?
Yes.
Was there much a sense of a community down there at Woolloomooloo at that time?
Some of the families were very good living, hard-working, what you'd call, salt of the earth and good, like the backbone of Australia, good, decent living families and hard-working. It was only my personal environment that was, that I took a long time to learn, was not the normal way of life. But people were very decent, good living people.
And was there a place that you'd say was the focal or social focus in the area where people would meet and talk and?
No. Out in the streets, there was no such thing as social clubs as I knew them. The adult people would be down the pub.
Right.
And after that, you'd go home, and there'd be drinking and parties at home.
Well, what about the women? Where would they talk? Well, I mean, can you remember
There was no such thing as community get-togethers with women that I can remember.
Well, even was there like a corner shop where people might stand around and gossip a bit, where they'd get news about what was going on in the neighbourhood? I mean, I don't mean a formal sort of place, but maybe a particular pub or, a particular place that people tended to go to and gossip.
It'd probably be in the pub. The women used to go into the wine saloon. When I say the wine saloon, it would be like away from the bar. See, women were not allowed in the public bar where the men were. And this was before 6 o'clock closing, so the pubs closed at 6. But the women all sat around in what they called the little saloon bar, which was specially for women, where they'd sit and have a beer or a drink of wine, and that's where they'd shell the peas ready for dinner. That's what they used to sit and shell the peas. I remember that.
What day? What time of the day?
Any day at all.
No, but I mean, was that in the evening or in the...
In the afternoon. In the afternoon. That's where the gossip. The women would be in the pubs in the afternoon, in this special little room that was the women's, they'd call it a lounge, which leaves a lot to be desired. I mean, there was a few chairs and a few little tables, and you'd sit there having a drink with your friends and gossiping and having a chat. That was the women's place for all the women to be, or any of the women that wanted to go to the hotel.
And
I mean, a lot of women didn't go to the hotel, but that's where my mum was probably, unless she was working at a hotel.
And they do the veggies there, just the peas?
Well, I remember that was the place, so yeah, if you wanted to shell the peas for dinner, you'd take them up the pub, and while you were talking and having a drink with your friends, that's where you'd shell the peas. Now, of course, it's a lot easier now. You get them, yes, anyway, you get them in frozen packs, but Mum seems to be...
Did she do that? Did she go there too?
Yes, yeah.
Did they have the hair in curlers while they did this? And scarves on their head? I have this image of this.
Yes.
And those bobby pins.
Strange. I've got a neighbour, this is off the road, a neighbour lives next to go to the pub.
Okay.
That's where I had to find her.
Right. Yeah. Now, I wanted to ask you about your schooling. What was school like at, say, Plunkett Street?
Well, it was a co-ed school. I can't remember much about the education. I wasn't that very good at school. And when I went home, I never had any encouragement about school work or homework. So I left school when I was 13 and a half. School, the education system, up to, what did I make, fifth grade. So I think I left school with what they call the QC, which was, don't even know what it stands for. But I've never had much of an education.
What about your school experience? Can you remember when you first went to school at, say, Darlinghurst?
No, there's really nothing. No, there's nothing in particular to remember.
Okay.
About school.
All right. Can you tell me about any local characters, aside from all the crims that used to hang around at your place? Can you remember any special people in the area that were particularly stand out?
There was a wonderful lady called Tassie Hamilton, who was a singer. Now, the ships used to come into the wharves opposite our house, given but one little street, and there was a factory or something just in front of there. The big ships used to come into the Finger Wharf. Some of the big ships were either American or the English, the P&O liners. Tassie Hamilton might have been free and easy with her body. She used to go down to the ships and sing, and she had the most beautiful voice, and she used to sing to the ships and to the boys on the ships when the ships left the wharf and were going out. I Saw Those Harbour Lights was one of her favourite songs, and she had the kind of voice that you would cry at. Tassie Hamilton became a professional singer later on, but her life as a child, she always wore high boots to her knees because her father had chopped her legs. Her legs had been chopped. She used to come into our place for a bath. She was friends of my mother's, so she was older than I. I believe later on she became successful, went over to America and opened a nightclub there called the Purple Onion. There was also one in Sydney, but she had one in San Francisco called the Purple Onion. A wonderful character.
What do you mean her legs were chopped? I mean, they weren't chopped.
She had
cut
from an axe. Her father had chopped her legs with an axe.
Mm.
So she always, I don't know if she's still alive. Well, I'm 70, so she would be 80. Whether she's still alive or not, there would be a lady to find for history and what conditions were like.
What other characters can you remember?
Other characters, wharf labourers, gangsters, ladies. Oh.
Was the Catwoman of Woolloomooloo around then?
The Catwoman of Woolloomooloo.
I don't know if she's a myth or if she really existed. Have you ever heard of her?
No, not as the Catwoman.
No.
But given a name, do you know a name?
No.
Just the Catwoman. What era? What
I don't
year?
know. It might be later, 40s, 50s. I don't know.
Catwoman.
Yeah. That's it. If you don't remember her, then...
No.
Okay.
Other characters of that time in Woolloomooloo that would have impressed me? No.
Okay. Where did most people work?
Well, the men were mostly wharf labourers in the Woolloomooloo area. My mother worked in a couple of offices, cleaning offices in town. She worked as a barmaid in nearly every hotel in Woolloomooloo. Women who had husbands, no, I don't know where they would have worked, but people had office jobs and regular other jobs.
Did women regularly work outside the home?
I would say yes. It depends on if you had a husband who was at home.
Yeah, but if you had a husband that was at home, would you still work outside?
No, because men were then in control. You would not really go and get a job if you had a husband, because jobs were needed, and so men were given preference, like as to have a job. Women were given the secondary jobs if you had to work, as in barmaids. Well, barmaids were popular. Cleaning, scrubbing, unless you had the brains or the money to open some sort of a little business, but that you would have had to have a lot more money than was around about for an average family in those days. I do remember, now you asked about going out further afield in a tram. I do remember going out from Woolloomooloo or Darlinghurst out to La Perouse to see the Snake Man. Have you heard about the Snake Man?
No, tell me about him.
Okay, there was a man out at La Perouse and he had snakes in a little hessian bag that he would catch, and you would go out to see these snakes and he would take them out, and that was like quite an entertainment to go out and see the man with the snakes. But more what I want to tell you about was the fact that in the Depression, the most of the area from Kensington out to La Perouse was covered in tents, and this is where the people all lived, in the tents. Families with no jobs, no money, no houses. They lived in tents, and you could see them with their little fires cooking or making pots of tea in the little kettles, and that's where a lot of people lived. Now that place was called, and this would be historically, and there must be photographs of it, that was called Happy Valley. And even as bad off perhaps as we were, Mum used to point out, and I remember it quite well, during Depression days. Now that was called Happy Valley, and that was where a lot of the families lived in the Depression.
Can you remember families that had to move out, couldn't pay the rent in Woolloomooloo? And
well, we often moved out. That's why we moved from house to house.
Were you doing midnight flits or whatever they're called?
Well, I'm not sure about midnight flits, but I know we moved from house to house. And too, there were a lot of houses empty, and I'd say because people couldn't pay the rent. And you also moved from one house to another if it had a better bath or a better backyard or a better house, considering the rent wasn't too much better. So depending on what man my mother lived with, if we were in better circumstances, we moved from Bland Street to Burke Street. the house was better. So maybe the rent was another shilling extra a week, but that's when Mum was living then with Dicky Mealing, who was a wharf labourer. So we could maybe afford a bit more rent. This was maybe then the war had started then.
How did you feel about the war and the outbreak of the war? How did that affect your... back to the outbreak of the war.
All right, the outbreak of the war in 1939, the European war was one thing, but the outbreak of the war in Japan was a different thing altogether, 1941, so I was, I was coming up 18, 17 and a half, 18. So all of a sudden the place was full of American soldiers and sailors. Most of our Australian soldiers and sailors were overseas in Europe, Egypt, fighting. So when the war started in Japan, and our war with Japan and America came in, then Woolloomooloo, and we'd moved up to King's Cross. The place was flooded with American soldiers and sailors. Now, while the war was bad, the American soldiers and sailors brought in a whole new lifestyle for teenage girls growing up. All of a sudden, we had men to go out with because our men were overseas. And when a ship would berth, they'd walk up towards King's Cross and they would pass the flat in which we used to live. Well, they hardly ever got past the flat. Either my mother would have them in, or I would have them in, or my sister. Although my sister was married, but he was away half the time. He was in the Merchant Navy. So the American soldiers and sailors were absolutely, I mean, it was wonderful. Here was all these men, like after the Great Depression, here's now all these men with flowers, manners, cigarettes for Mum, chewing gum, chocolates, taking you out to restaurants, eating. We couldn't believe all this. Now, although I was raped during the war because I was 18 and a half and I was a virgin, we knew we had to be virgins, but we didn't know what constituted rape. I didn't know, although I knew what sex was, but I didn't know under the threat of death in the local park that that's really what made up rape. Then the soldier was here for a month. I don't know why I never fell pregnant, but I didn't. And then when you went to look for your soldier, who you were always going to be married to some American soldier, well, they'd be gone. They were shipped out and gone. You'd go to look for them and they'd be gone. That didn't matter. You got a new boyfriend the next day or the day afterward. So the war actually, as teenage girls and for women, here, now I'm not talking about, of course, mothers, wives who had, sons and husbands and boyfriends going away. But the fact that the Americans came in, if you were a single person, you were treated very well. And of course the Americans all came with all these things that we had never seen before. And they were very courteous. So then started the life of going out, dancing. Wow, found out about jitterbugs, dancing and music, and all the things that came along, which unfortunately came through the war, but it was another lifestyle altogether.
Well, after the Japanese started shelling Sydney,
yes,
was there at any time where you were afraid and thought of leaving Woolloomooloo? No.
There was a blackout one night. It could have been the night, there were air raid sirens, and there was a blackout one night, and Frances and my girlfriend from Woolloomooloo, we all came up to King's Cross in the blackout. We thought it was a great idea. We all went to the pictures and thought, what fun, here we are all having this wonderful time. And then we remember the shells coming off the submarines. One shell blew out a step or a shop front in Paddington somewhere. They were quite close, actually. They'd come in quite close. But we really, and it was, we'd come to Bondi, and Bondi was covered in barbed wire. There were shelters built everywhere, including the Domain, because we'd go to the Domain and everybody was busy digging trenches for shelters where we all had to go and hide. We didn't really think there was that much, considering we were so young, we really didn't think that there was that much danger until, of course, our parents, or if any parents, but, you know, your mother and everybody would have realised. Then rationing started. They would have realised about the danger. Rationing started with food. But regarding the war affecting us, I suppose the Americans just brought in a completely different lifestyle.
Yeah.
Considering all our Australian men were overseas fighting.
Can you remember when the that ferry was sunk?
Yes.
The Cuttable?
No, I can't remember that.
Okay. You were going to say, you mentioned before about another accident with a ferry in the war. What was that?
When some of the American ships left harbour, there would be a small ferry boat. And I remember one, I don't know the name of it, but I remember one where a lot of the girls went out on the ferry boat to wave goodbye to the ship and to the sailors, and the ferry boat would follow the ships. All the girls go to one side, and the ferry capsized. Now, some of the American sailors were jumping overboard trying to save them. I can't remember the name of the ferry, but my sister had tried to go on the ferry, and it was full, and she couldn't get on. There were quite a few ladies, quite a few young girls drowned on that ferry. Mm. That should be history somewhere. So the ships would come in for stay for quite a long time. There was one ship that was stationed in Woolloomooloo during World War II, an American ship, the USS Dobbin. It was here for so long, and it was used as a base ship, so eventually they called it the USS Venereal Disease, because everyone on it had venereal disease.
Oh, gee.
Now that was it was used as a base ship, so every sailor got venereal disease, and that's what it was called, the USS Venereal Disease, USS VD. But the name of the ship was the USS Dobbin. Okay. It's so funny, I remember that so well. Well, I was too young for all that stuff just then, so I escaped all that.
Just think, what sounds can you remember from your childhood, say when you were 10 and 11? What, if you think back of Woolloomooloo and Darlinghurst at that time, what sounds do you associate with the area?
Gee.
Okay, what places, when you think back to your childhood, what places in, you know, Darlinghurst and Woolloomooloo are important to you now that you associate with from that time?
Places. The wharves, sounds, can I say sounds now? Were the ships, 3 hoots for going out, 3 hoots. You could always hear the ships, and they would always leave at sunset and go out. So the places in Woolloomooloo,
what places that exist now?
The Finger Wharf, the hotels on the corner. One is now quite a trendy bistro and hotel. Used to be the Rock and Roll Hotel. Before that, during World War II, it was called something else.
Was it ever called Louis at the Loo? Or was that another part?
No, Louis is a smaller hotel. That's my mother was a barmaid there too. That's on the corner of the street where we used to live, or around the corner. That's on the corner of Nicholson Street and Burke Street, I think, if I remember correctly. Louis at the Loo. I think that was the Tilbury Hotel. My mother used to work in the Frisco Hotel and the Tilbury Hotel and the Rock and Roll Hotel. Mm-hmm. We had neighbours when the war broke out. There was a neighbour called Billy Swan. Now, we were only quite young kids, and he was a beautiful man, and he used to give us money, which was, you know, a big deal, in sixpence for lemonade and chocolates and ice cream. Billy went away during the war. He was in Changi. He was a big fat man when he went away. When he came home, he was just a skeleton, and later on he died. But I remember him, and there were quite a few in the family of Swans. I don't know how many, but boys and girls, and they were quite a good living family. I remember Billy because he was very kind to us when we were kids, and they were some of the men outside in the streets that would make sure that you were being looked after. You kids are all right, you can get home okay, or, you know, you better go inside now. Yes, some of those men would take care of the kids. The sounds, the places. No, the wharves were my play area.
I'm just trying to think. What's your happiest memory?
Coming home from school and getting my billycart. The happiest memory when I was a kid, gee, isn't that sad? Is that my happiest memory? My God. There must have been, I don't know, maybe going swimming with my beautiful girlfriends, going to the beaches. Maybe going, Mum might have taken us out. Mum must have taken us out a few places, but
You can't remember?
not when I was 12, 13, 14. That had gone into the party and drinking stage.
What about when you were 10?
She might have taken me out then. I've got a photograph of her taking me to the Gladys Moncrief concert. And I would have been 10 or 11. Once Mum started drinking, life went downhill. And she started drinking when I was about 10 or 11. Other places to remember and the happiest times of my childhood. I think in Woolloomooloo it was just my girlfriends that I found friends to play with.
Look, I think I've asked all the questions. Oh, what jokes? Can you remember any jokes that you used to play?
Oh, well, yes, banging on the door and running down the street with a piece of string. Well, banging on the door and then running like mad around the corner where they couldn't find you. We thought that was a great trick. That was one of the jokes kids would play on any of the neighbours. It was just very simple, you know, silly little kid stuff. I don't think anybody had the brains to get up to some of the things that the kids 10 and 11 and 12 would think of doing now.
What were the most popular newspapers and magazines of the day? Did you?
Well, I remember getting The Truth, and Mum would always say, "You're not allowed to read that. Somebody's been murdered or something terrible has happened. You're not allowed to read The Truth." Any other papers I can't remember, but I remember it was the Sunday Truth. I only remember probably because I was told you got into trouble if you were caught reading it.
Can you, you've talked about illnesses that children had, but can you remember in terms of your friends or school friends or just in terms of the adult world, what sort of things illnesses adults had?
Polio was very big then. A friend of mine was married just after World War II, and her husband died of infantile paralysis.
He got it when he was older?
Yes. There was no serum. It hadn't been invented yet. Illnesses, venereal disease, I remember as a kid seeing it because my mother would make a point of pointing out my friend's mother who had syphilis. She had big sores all over her legs.
Were they distinctive sorts of sores?
Oh yes, big ulcers, weeping pus. She eventually died of syphilis. See, there was no cure for that. Syphilis, the serum for syphilis and polio, well, the war brought about a lot of, Sue, what's the word for?
Oh, in medicines and stuff like that. Yes,
what's the word?
developments in technology.
Yes, the war brought about a lot of developments and serums for these different diseases that occurred during the war, and two of them were gonorrhea and syphilis. There was no cure for that beforehand.
Okay, look, I'll ask all the questions.
I'm trying to think of a word. Am I on camera?
Yeah,
What's the word?
advances, you mean?
Advances, experiments. No, what? Oh, Darling, scientific.
Yeah.
Scientific.
Breakthroughs.
Breakthrough. Yes, scientific breakthroughs. The war brought through really. There were hardly any advancements in any of these diseases, and the war, suddenly these scientists and medical men were experimenting. Now, what are we finding, for all these diseases that were becoming worse during the war?
Mm.
And you weren't, like chicken pox and all the kids had all that stuff. So young people who don't get inoculated now, they say, well, it isn't around. Of course it's not around, because they've developed some sort of serum for it.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else that you wanted to say that we haven't covered? I thought we'd get some pictures of you looking at your photo album, and so we just want to...
Well, there must have been happy days, but impressed upon the mind are the more traumatic experiences. But I've got to say, a lot of the other families that I met were very hard-working and very good people that lived in Woolloomooloo. And they were the backbone of Australia that made our country, hard-working. No money, and yet we survived and got through whatever it was.
Okay. Thank you.
That's my lovely girlfriend in Adelaide. That was my handsome Air Force flyer that I loved. He was wounded and he went back to America. And he married the nurse. Wasn't he handsome? Well, I don't know that I can mention. All right, this girl, it's her mother who died of syphilis. And they had a very bad... She was also affected mentally, very much, her and her sister, as they grew up. The lifestyle. See, Americans bought us flowers. We never had flowers before that. So that they were on the USS Fletcher, and that was sunk. They were all killed. There's Williams. Betty Davis in something. Our, whatever that would be. Oh, wait a minute. Can I turn that around?
Yep.
Red Skelton, Bathing Beauty. Esther Williams in Bathing Beauty with Red Skelton.
They're good.
I can see your foot, Mum.
Oh, are you doing this, are you?
Yep.
Oh, okay. Well, which ones do you want? Of the war. See, a lot of these were... Oh, wait a minute, these have got to come down out of the way. Okay, we all used to swim at 7 Shilling Beach. There's Maclean Street, Woolloomooloo. Warranuri River, that's when we're all swimming. See, 1945, so the war was just ending. And we used to get the train to National Park and go down Warranuri River, because there was no pollution then, and you could go and there were hardly any houses. So we used to swim in the river.
The war times are probably your happiest memories, really, in your life. Well, I don't know about
Isn't
yourself.
it well, see, 50, that's later on.
Mm.
Two, now South Sydney, okay, that's Bondi, later on, 1949.
Well, everybody from South Sydney used to come to Bronte and Bondi Beach. It was a
yes.
real
It was
bit
a
of
place,
a mecca, a place to go.
well, Bondi was very popular. I think more people came to Bondi then than now.
Really?
Okay, that's my stepfather and my mother when they got married and came up to Tuggerah Lakes. So I was already there. So American sailors were everywhere. Abortions.
Oh, damn. I
Didn't
meant to
you
ask
about
it. I
abortions?
meant
All
to.
right. It depends. This girl was 8 months, had an abortion,
At 8
died.
months.
Oh, died. This is Katoomba. That's my sister and my mother, and my mother's sister, Dennis, my mother's son. Yes, that was me when I was little, and then, as I say, not long after that, See, I might have been happy then, Sue. We were dressed okay, and probably then that's when my father was around as, you know, providing.
Because later on you weren't dressed well?
I remember, my mother says I'm telling lies, but I remember not having, I didn't have any shoes when I was 12, 13.